I do sometimes wonder why I even bother making these videos. I know I come across as brutal and in some ways arrogant, but not at you guys, I mean towards the brands. But my feedback should serve as fair critique to those brands, yet this is the third printer from Nova 3D I've had, and I've said the same thing about their previous printers. They are generally fine in that they tick the box of working printer, and they do have some interesting features that I've not seen from other brands. But unless Nova 3D put in some more effort, in fact a lot more effort, into the details, they've got absolutely no chance of being taken seriously in the modern market. So for those of you watching and those of you from other brands, consider this as an example of what not to do. Hi, I'm Ross, and this is Fohammer Videos. I need to say, when I first saw renders of this machine, I was impressed. It looked like a more professional step up from the brand, but as soon as I got it in my hands, I could immediately see how rough around the edges it was. No, literally, the edges of the machine are rough to the touch. If I walk through it, I see the base is metal. Now, on the one hand, it's sturdy, yay, but as I took the rear panel off to see if I could access the internals for easy maintenance, assuming that was its intended placement, I noticed that this is just a panel. And what I'm taking from this is that the printer is made from these materials not to be sturdy, but because Nova 3D are a smaller company, and it's just easier for them to cut and bend metal plates to make the chassis. It does have an Ethernet port along with power supply socket on the back. It also has integrated Wi-Fi, but they've said you need to be 7 meters away from your Wi-Fi router in order for it to actually have a chance of connecting. I'll talk more about its network functionality when we get to the usage section. It is nice to see a USB port on the front along with a click-clack power button, but let's be fair, neither of these features are major selling points. The lid is up and over, but the mechanics are odd. Every time you move it, you can actually feel the bolts are loose in the chassis and just rock. I tried to tighten this as tight as it would go, but even then it still rocked, and this also prevented the lid from closing. As I've come to use this printer, I've also noticed that the material for the lid has started to develop these small little micro fractures inside, and I'm not sure what could have caused this. I've never seen this happen before. The build plate surface is also just rough. It's not etched, it's not sanded, it's not smooth. I've got no other words to describe it other than it's just a rough texture. Now when it comes to leveling, the website says this has a one-step leveling design, but not only is that statement wrong, the way it's wrong is actually an undersell. So the way it works here is that leveling uses 4 struts with bolts in, and Nova used thin metal shims to balance out the level of each corner of the plate. Nova 3D have said that printers will go out pre-calibrated, as mine was, and they even send spare shims just in case there are any issues. Now honestly, I actually like this. It's 0 steps for the user, unless you do a firmware update, because after that you need to reset the 0 position, but it's a solid approach that is adjustable, and they don't talk up any of this 0 leveling crap that we've heard from other brands. But this also points out the lacking feature of the machine. This printer has no pressure sensing features at all. Yeah, there's not much more to say on that. It doesn't, which makes the software on this one kinda outdated, but I've got more to say on the software later. The Z-rail is a ball screw, which is good, and in this case even has a cover in front of it to prevent errant resin splashes getting into the mechanism. But one thing the website also advertises is dual limit switches, and it kind of talks this up like it's a selling point. The point of having 2 limit switches is to prevent the mechanism going beyond the upper limit, something that was a clear problem I noticed on the Whale 3. But that means it's more hardware, and the costs of that extra hardware are passed on to us, and I just don't understand why we're paying for an extra piece of hardware to solve this problem when other brands have solved it with firmware. Moving down, the vat is nice. It's large enough to hold more than a full bottle of resin, and it comes with PFA film, and we actually have a machine with a decent pour spout. And this one also has the same resin feed feature as the last, which I have always said I love for its simplicity. I've always said I'm not a fan of resin pumps, and this spring-loaded cap is a great way to have a spare bottle of resin handy for when you need a refill during a large print. Yes, this does only work with Nova's bottles or bottles from other brands that are the same, but you can always just use one up and refill it with your own resin if you want to use this feature. I like it, it's handy. This is one place where I feel the simplicity of design trumps the more over-engineered approaches of mechanical resin pumps and expensive proprietary bottles. Before we come onto the screen, we've got the heater. This is a chamber heater, and unlike the previous whale, this one can stay on during a print. However, it's turned on and off manually in the UI. It doesn't come on and preheat the resin before a print starts. It doesn't even turn off when the print ends. It's completely separately controlled in the UI to turn it on or off when you decide. And I've got to be honest, with how hot the power supply gets when this is on and the way the rest of the UI is laid out, which cements to me a lack of faith in this brand's software engineering, I have a hard time trusting to leave this thing on. And all that's before we talk about this being a chamber heater on a printer with a huge vent hole in the back. Now, Nova have said they'll ship a sticker out to cover this hole, but that does nothing about the big gaps down the sides of the lid. When it comes to the screen, we've got a 16K display, and I'll say this right now, there's no visible difference I can make out between 16K and the previous 14K or 12K screens I've tested. Maybe it's a bit better than 8K in terms of print smoothness, but if you want to ensure there are no visible voxel and layer lines, yeah, you still need to enable anti-aliasing, which is something else I'll come back to when we talk about the software. But I doubt we'll see a change in this until we get to sub 10 micron pixels, and it's taken nearly 2 years to go from 29 to what's now 19, and progress is slowing along the way. But the main gripe I have about these new 16K displays that everyone's using, and I'm not on a crusade against it, and I know these are a necessary step towards smaller pixels despite other brands showing us that even 8K 10-inch screens can give us better printing results, but in this generation, the display is a bit smaller, and despite the advertised 10-inch build area on Nova's website, this is the same 9.6-inch display that other brands are using. Yeah, it's a small difference, but it's something which is disappointing to those of us with the larger build area of older printers for the same print quality. Well, I say the same print quality, but in my case, I wasn't able to match the same level of detail on my exposure tests when compared to even other 16K printers on the market right now. This appears to either be LCD bloat or heavy layer compression. I could probably solve this by adjusting the Z offset more and typically slowing down the early layer wait times, but I'm currently unable to set independent wait times in Nova Maker for base and normal layers, and at the time of review, Chitubox isn't fully compatible. I expect it will be by the time you get your hands on it, but again, I've had issues. And personally, as a printing hobbyist, I'm after something that I have to do less with. So when again, I don't need to worry about this on other printers, it's just, it's a level of extra steps that I don't want to walk through. But all in all, it prints and the quality is fine. I genuinely can't think of many scenarios where we would need better print quality anyway, but brands have got to chase those bigger numbers, haven't they? Now, I also tested the light uniformity on this printer, as one thing I noticed during the firmware update that I had to do is that you can apply a layer mask, and by the way, the firmware update is a manual process using the USB drive despite it having Wi-Fi and therefore the potential for over-the-air updates. But when you apply the mask, it actually lights up the screen too, so whenever you're doing a firmware update, yeah, you need to remove your VAT and plate and find somewhere safe to put it just to do that software change. And the reason they have this layer mask, and it's not the only machine that has it, just the only machine I've seen so far where you can edit it, is that because COB light sources are sharper than LED arrays, they're actually also brighter in some areas of the screen than others. So whenever you cure a layer, this mask will actually increase the opacity on areas of the screen to balance the light out when you print. And the longer you use an LCD, the more this can actually change across the surface of a panel. And after doing my testing, I fed this back to Nova 3D, who actually gave me an updated layer mask, which I could then apply to the printer. And you could probably edit this too in some image editing application if you want to play with it. So that is handy that we've got the ability to change it here, and I'd like to see this sort of feature incorporated into more machines in a better way, maybe driven by the UI and you get a special tester. Some brands have done this, but they're brands I'm scared to mention without inviting more hate to this channel. But the thing is, I suspect most people, bar some of the more technical users watching, would be like, What? Yeah, no, I've got no desire to deal with any of that. I just want to print, and if a panel goes to shit, I'll replace it. And if you really want to do this, then you may be better just doing it in UV Tools software anyway, with better control than what this gives you. But speaking of the UI, it's one of the worst, and again, don't get me wrong, it's not unusable, but it's daft and annoying when compared to others on the market. It's got a menu for settings, for example, but the heater settings is in the tools menu. The option for moving the plate up and down requires you to actually set the distance value each time you want to change it by typing it in. So when I had to re-zero the bed after the firmware update, I had to tell it to move in increments of 10mm, then 1mm, then 0.1, and then 0.01 every time I wanted to change the value that it moved by, rather than doing what every other brand seems to have done for years and just having 3 or 4 buttons there as standard. And then there's the slicer, Nova Maker, which is also the only way you can access this printer remotely via Wi-Fi. They haven't done, again, what every other brand have done and integrated in with things like Chitubox's network functionality. And whilst with all the resin printer reviews I've done, I've typically said I much prefer to use the slicer that is bundled with and intended for the printer, because that generally avoids printing bugs. Well, it did here. This is such a limited app that I can't even find a way to make a custom resin profile in lieu of just editing the few existing ones. And there's also no way of enabling 2-stage motion control in the slicer either. So I moved over to Chitubox, as it was said that this is supported, but Nova Maker have since confirmed they're still working on this, because the file I sliced with anti-aliasing enabled took an age to render. It was like over 26 minutes, and it was so large that it actually exceeded the 4GB file size limit of FAT32, which is the format of the USB drive. And I've tried it in the past using exFAT, and the result for me has always been that the print just stops printing at a certain degree. The other issue I encountered is that when I sliced it without anti-aliasing enabled, the printer completely ignored the second stage of its lift height, which overall, considering I could only use 1 stage of lift, or Nova Maker, which only has 1 stage of lift, makes this machine incredibly slow to print. Now, I'm sure updates are coming, but I've got no desire to come back to this machine and test it again later, or even use it now. The be-all and end-all is that this is the 3rd Nova 3D machine I've tested, and they're still making the exact same mistakes they made nearly 2 years ago. The printer has just so many cheap elements and crappy details that I can't take it seriously as a contender, and that's before I look at the price. And even if it was half its current special launch price, it's still then up against printers that give us the same print quality, a slightly larger build area, some more modern features, and better overall build quality. I'll be honest, I really wanted to be nicer to Nova 3D here more than other brands, because I like to root for an underdog. Don't we all? And it must be hard to compete in a market dominated by such larger companies. I will be fair and say there are probably some very technical resin printer users out there who will get a kick out of this and see value in it. But if there's one thing I've learned from the masses of resin printer users out there, we don't want this. We don't want this level of control. We want the printer to do more for us, and we just get acceptable prints out the end of it. I feel that the masses will want convenience, and then the most reliable convenience. This probably is a reliable and consistent printer with no modern convenience. But honestly, Nova, if you want to compete in this space, you need to do something interesting that the other brands aren't doing just to stand out. And you also need to put a lot more effort into the details too. For those of you watching, if you want to buy this, I'll have an affiliate link down below the video. I want to say thanks for watching, and a huge thanks goes to our members who are on screen now. Please consider joining them to get your name up in the credits, along with early access and exclusive videos. Don't forget to join our Discord channel too. Again, links in the description. Until next time, I ain't afraid of no ghosts. Which is the same quote I used in my last Nova 3D review, but since they clearly never watched it, I may as well reuse it. Thanks everyone, Fohammer out.